Yeah, we'll behave.
Are you sure?
No.
We're in good company.
It's a bully.
Good company. All right, so first of all, I just wanted to welcome you all this morning to the Current Issues in Education lecture on bullying. My name is Amanda Sommerfeld. I'm a clinical assistant professor in the counseling psychology program here at Boston University. And I think as you're all aware, there's been a lot of events in Massachusetts and across the nation that have really brought to our attention the kind of poignant and distressing things that are happening in our schools between peers related to bullying. So there's been kind of calls, I would say, on the policy and the practice levels to really try and make more dedicated efforts to not only identifying bullying behavior, but also creating interventions that will prevent harm or respond to bullying. So thankfully, we have Dr. Dorothy Espelage here, who is going to talk to us about this issue. Dr. Espelage is one of the country's foremost experts on bullying. She earned her doctorate in counseling psychology from Indiana University, and since then has been working in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Currently, she's a professor of child development and also the associate chair of that department. For 2 more months. I'm doing it. So for the past 17 years, Dr. Espelage has conducted research on bullying and has presented regularly at national conferences on the topic. She's the author of over 70 professional publications, including 3 books. Currently, her research on bullying assessment, prevention, and intervention is funded by grants from the CDC and also the National Science Foundation. As a result of all this incredible work, she's received numerous honors, including recently being named University Scholar, receiving fellow status in Division 17 of the American Psychological Association, and being elected Vice President of Division E of the American Educational Research Association. Beginning this year, I believe, also serve as the Associate Editor of the Journal of Counseling Psychology.
It's already started, yes.
All right.
Send your manuscripts, Journal of Counseling Psych, but only good ones.
That's right. So help me welcome her.
Thank you. Okay with me sitting? They're filming it, so. Well, there's a saying, I'm from Virginia, and I'm from a trailer park, and we used to say as kids, I told you so. I told you so. So for 17 years, I've been trying to get the United States of America to pay attention to this phenomenon, and they finally are. Unfortunately, and I'm going to try not to be negative, but I'm going to be realistic. I think many of us are practitioners. You work with teachers. We're in the schools. We understand the climate in which teachers are working. We've got a long way to go. And so I'm going to talk to you. It's a very short period of time. Clearly, I've studied this for 17 years. I live, eat, and breathe this. Joan said, you want to go to lunch yesterday? I was like, no, I have 2 grants due. I want to stay in this beautiful room and work. We have a tremendous amount of work to do. We're in a climate, unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen, even under this administration. What is that? It's the venting system?
Yeah.
I'm from a state institution. I can work with all kinds of things. So I want to send a very clear message that we still have a lot of work to do. In the federal system now, they're thinking they're going to fund between 3 to 8% of protocols in DC. So clearly, which used to be 35%, so clearly the work is not going to happen until the recession kind of lifts, right? So bullying is, as much as we think it's on the radar, it's not that much on the radar, okay? So, but what we can talk about, if we are trying to make strides within teacher education and training our administrators to be sensitive about bullying, there are some things we can do without the big dollars coming from the federal government. Okay. So I am also on the offset. We just had, everybody's probably aware, a White House conference on bullying. Did anybody watch the streaming? No, of course not. Well, it's probably good that you did not, because it was very disappointing, right? Here I am, I had to remember, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I'm from the trailer park and I'm in the White House, this is pretty amazing, but at the same time, it was ultimately very disappointing because there was no serious conversation about what it would take to reduce bullying in our schools, right? It was a puppet show. So, you guys don't need to know all the frustrations, but I want you to be realistic right now. I also, at the same time, recognize that I'm in a state where your legislation, whatever, and you may know the context behind it, is a model legislation in this country, good or bad, whatever you think about it. I was just on the governor's task force where we modeled our legislation in the state of Illinois after Massachusetts. I know every line of it, and so you are leading the field in a way. Massachusetts, Jersey, and Florida have the best legislation out of the 45 states that have legislation. Now, we also are at a time where we are mandating school districts to do certain things, but there's no funding behind it, right? So we want to talk about the complexity of bullying and trying to stop it. We had a conversation at breakfast this morning. Can we actually do something about it? I think we can minimize it. I think if you look at good child development research, you recognize that there's always going to be hierarchies and peer groups. We just want to minimize the damage that it does to children, okay? Now, in the advent of technologies introducing a complexity that we've never seen in our lives in child development and understanding how kids are taking what we know of just incivility in some ways and taking it to a level that goes beyond the school building. So this is complex. And as much as you look at the research panel from the White House, they did not represent any complexity, right? It was a sad case. There was 130 people invited to the White House, 7 researchers. So you already know we're really important, right? 7 researchers invited, 7 academics, if you will, and 4 of them chose to take the platform and go very in a safe direction. Did not mention gender, did not mention culture, did not mention racism, did not mention any of the isms. Right? So we didn't have a serious conversation about how it is that we're creating generations of kids that really are uncivil. I mean, there's you're in the schools, I'm in the schools. So let me kind of also give you a context for my work and where I'm at in 17 years, after 17 years of doing this. So I was a Lone Ranger 17 years ago talking about something that nobody wanted to talk about, right? No one would come to my talks. Then there was a school shooting in Columbine, right? And the media got it all wrong and called it a bullying incident. No, we had mental health issues and a psychopath, really. But the media got this going, so we studied bullying. Now everyone's talking about it, but they're not having a serious conversation about what we need to do to create safe schools. Our schools mirror our community. That's the conversation we need to recognize, right? So I come at it right now. I'm in the throes of a randomized clinical trial in 38 middle schools. I observe teachers implementing a bullying prevention program called Second Step every week, from Wichita, Kansas to Chicago Public Schools inner city. I sit, and all of you, if you observe teachers, you know this painful process, right? Because I can't help them. I'm just there for fidelity checks. And I put my head down oftentimes. I think this is the longest 50 minutes of my life. I'm so glad I'm not a student in this teacher's class, because I would probably never learn anything, right? So it's not bullying prevention. So I sit there and I draw these 3 circles as a good academic, right? I draw a circle just mostly because it's like a scary movie where you don't want that person to go in the door, you know? So you're watching this teacher, watching these teachers who have no classroom management skills, right? So circle classroom management skills, predicts implementation of Second Step, predicts efficacy. So I recognize that as much as we have programs that are marketed and people are making millions of dollars off of bullying prevention, I recognize that only when teachers can manage their classroom and develop efficacy in delivering anything from math, science, doesn't matter. We're never going to have a program that works. So we're going to have a serious conversation today. And because I have written 80 articles and, I don't know, 12 grants last year, I have a lot to say. So please stop me if I'm not making sense. I spend a lot of time by myself. I was telling Kathy. I usually talk to myself. I live in hotel rooms. So just stop me if I'm not clear. Yes?
You had the 3 circles. I missed one. Class management.
Yeah, so I'm going to actually draw, because this is what I'm trying, and I'm pitching to the feds, that this is what they should pay for, because it doesn't matter. So classroom management strategies, right, predicts implementation. And it could be math, Second Step, bullying, whatever it is. This management, you're never going to get to fidelity here. And I'm in a randomized clinical trial where somebody's giving me a couple $1 million, right, to stop bullying. Okay? This, stop bullying, right, when they're at home in violent homes, right? Good luck with that. Okay, so classroom management predicts the goes to implementation, there goes to efficacy. Part of this issue is that you've elected to have me come and talk to you about the realities of these types of programs, right? And your state and other states are going to mandate that schools have these programs. Well, they're not going to work if they don't focus on the teacher's ability to deliver any kind of classroom management. But most people wouldn't get up here and say it when they've got federal funding, right? Like my project officers are really like, what are you doing, Dorothy? I'm predicting that, in fact, where it's going to work is in the classrooms where the teachers have good classroom management skills. We're not measuring that because they didn't give us enough money to do that. But so essentially what I'm going to say is tell the truth. The problem is we have prevention scientists all over the country who, by the way, do not even go into the schools when they do these randomized clinical trials. They're not telling the truth about why it is that these things are not working. I totally know you. I feel like I know you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So familiar. Okay, so we're not going to have necessarily, I set this stage and I take a lot of the time, but I think that context is important because I'm not going to say, here's the, I think we have this book, this is a hilarious book we wrote, Realistic Strategies for Prevention and Intervention, totally out of date already. That we have to set the context for this, and I could give a talk on multiple different domains of the research that we do. And as we uncover and do the research, something else comes up. And I'm going to talk to you about something that's very problematic in the area of bullying. Why did we have a White House conference? Does anybody know and want to recognize why it is that Obama actually had a White House conference on bullying? What do you think triggered this?
Political.
It's political, but there's other things. Suicides. I heard suicides. There's suicides, but if you look at all the rash of suicides, and today someone, I mean, it happens every day, right? So it's not just in Massachusetts, it's everywhere. The highest percentage of kids that are killing themselves because of bullying right now are LGBT, lesbian and gay and bisexual transgender youth. And so what I want to talk to you about this morning, and certainly this talk could span to racism, it could span to hate crimes that are emerging in our communities because of perceptions of Muslims and Arabs. So it could be, we haven't ventured into that research domain, but what we now know is that the landscape of bullying is very different than it was even 17 years ago when I was starting to interview kids. And so it's an area in which, and we can talk about the cyber stuff, and I'll tell you a few tidbits about that, but we have to recognize that the demographics of our classrooms are changing, but yet our prevention programs are not, right? So the federal government, the United States, supports a program that was translated essentially from Norway, transported. It's not transporting very well from Norway. Just been to Norway. I said to Kathy this morning, who has been to Norway? Very different. Right? I sit in Chicago Public Schools, I'm like, this is so not Norway. So we have to recognize that I'm giving a talk next month in Montreal at SRCD, and the title is The Ship Has Sailed. The ship's gone, right? And I'm not fighting the ship. I don't want to get on that ship. I'm going to create my own little Noah's Ark. And we're going to create a better way of thinking about bullying prevention. It may not be funded by the federal government, and that's okay, but I think somebody needs to understand that the world in which kids live is not like Norway. And not to pick just on that program, we still have prevention programs for bullying, and there's 67 of them, by the way, that use a VCR. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. So it's not only that the content is not up to date, and the kids are just sitting there going, okay, this is not my world when you talk about this, but it's also not even using the innovation, right? Really the innovation that we need to keep up with speed with our children. So we've done a lot of work. I'm going to talk to you about something that's rampant in the middle schools, late elementary school and middle school, and that's what's called homophobic teasing, which is a precursor to sexual violence. This is, you can imagine my entry into school with all these terms. Right? Yes, please come in our school and help us with our sexual violence problem. Not usually the case. No. So I do want to acknowledge, I don't do this work just by myself. We have lots of funding. I have beautiful graduate students. I've graduated about 27 of them, which is interesting. Only 3 of them are in the academy, so really good training to train them away from the academy. But they're out there doing great work as practitioners for sure. And lots of good schools and teachers and principals that allow us to come in and ask the hard questions. I mean, you'll see from this particular study, funded by the Centers for Disease Control, that we asked some questions that many researchers would not be comfortable asking. So I'm going to just give you a definition. Okay, so this is intriguing too, because we haven't even agreed upon a definition of bullying, right? So even if you look at your legislation, I like Massachusetts' definition in some way. You've got a nice one. I'm hoping we adopt that at the national level. You see how groundbreaking Massachusetts is, really. We actually have no idea that now the federal government has convened a consensus meeting on the definition of bullying in June. So we're going to sit down and decide on a definition. It's 20 years post adopting a Norwegian definition. We're really pro-Norway, you know, pro-Norway. So, but essentially, this is a sticky subject because in some definitions across the United States, some actually feel that exclusion and being mean to someone is bullying. Is it? Really? Really? So we have this real struggle of what actually it is. When does just not liking someone become bullying? Right? Do you like everybody that you work with? Yes, of course you do. They're all around you. The reality is that there's going to be difference. We're human, right? There's going to be personality clashes. Does that make it bullying within the context of school? And so this definition really includes this idea that it's different than normal conflict for kids that can be mediated. Right? So even the definition lends itself to different types of prevention efforts. Because what are you going to mediate in a bullying context if somebody's just mean and torments you? There's really nothing to mediate. Right? So here we know that it includes verbal, physical, relational, rumor spreading. We now take all of that really kind of meanness and nastiness, and then it becomes cyber aggression or aggression, electronic aggression within the context of the medium. If you do watch the White House research panel, the gentleman out of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire did the best job of, one, saying to the general public, let's all calm down a little bit. Most of your kids are doing wonderful things on the computer. Okay? And two, we have very good developmental science behind understanding aggression. We just need to see how that developmental science theories and practice translate to the medium of the cell phone and the computer. Right? So child development has a lot to say about how kids are taking these, struggles in childhood and adolescence and is playing out in the medium. So that'll give you some definition. What's unique about bullying, and we debate about this tremendous amount in the academy, is that it tends to be repeated over time and involve a power differential. It's taken about 10 years to convince the general public and also journal editors that, in fact, the power differential doesn't have to be size. Right? We move slow in our perceptions, right? Because we watch TV, and has this penetrated to teachers' knowledge? No, absolutely not. The teachers get very confused when they see a big victim. Like, hello, you're huge. Why? How could you be a victim? So the size is, we still have to kind of work with teachers' knowledge around many of these issues. We now know that the power differential can be social in nature. Right? And so we have to, but what's repeatedly? I could have one event that happened on Tuesday and it's just so horrific in the school, and it didn't repeat itself, but it's so bad that it's, changed the way in which I think about myself. So these are great debates. But recognize that it's not a normal conflict and you didn't ask for it. And oftentimes the bully leader and the bully groups, I use my language very intentionally, the groups that torment victims do come after you. Right? If you allow them to, but kids are fighting back. So we have a whole host of many in here who are probably victimized as a kid, and the way that you dealt with it is you fought back, and they never messed with you again. I hear that all the time. Yeah, I was bullied once. I took care of it. Never came after me again. I was like, ooh, I'm not putting that in my book, but I hear that often, all the time. For the discussion here, and this is a long definition of sexual violence, and it's way too early to read parts of it. We're really talking about in middle school, and through this study we observed that sexual violence is really homophobic teasing in middle school. And I'm going to suggest that it is a mediator and a precursor to more severe forms of sexual violence. Now, why is this important? Many of you are probably thinking, why are we at a bullying and we have this kind of language up on the screen? I'll just flip through it so you don't have to think about some of the words on here. So, why is this important? So let me paint a picture of the brilliant things that we do in the United States. So there was a recent trend about 10 years ago mostly during the Bush administration, when during the Bush administration, kids weren't having sex, by the way. And I'm Catholic, so it was just large amounts of immaculate conception. They weren't having sex, and they definitely weren't anything but heterosexual, right? We didn't have sexual identity during the Bush administration. We had abstinence models in our schools. Why is that important? Well, it trickled down to the rape prevention educators on the street. They no longer could get in the schools to talk to kids about rape. Shut down. No thank you, wouldn't return their calls. They then said, okay, how are we going to get in to talk to the kids? They said, bullying. I'm here to help you with your bullying problem, not your rape problem, right? And so many of us that have studied gender issues watched this happen. It made us very concerned. So what has happened is most of the sexual assault dollars and the sexual assault coalitions have bought into this, are pumping all of their money into bullying prevention because they can get access to the schools. So if they think if they get into the schools, then they can throw a little discussion about rape in there or attitudes towards girls. Well, that's not what was happening. They continue to use bullying prevention programs, assuming that if kids are nice in elementary school and middle school, that they will not rape women on college campuses. So this is very important. Many of you work with college students, and Kathy and I were talking this morning, college students are adolescents. So anything I talk about, it's applicable to them. So what we need to recognize is millions and millions of dollars were taken out of rape prevention, put into bullying prevention with no empirical support whatsoever to say that the overlapping predictors of bullying are the same for sexual violence. So what is happening? We're seeing a huge spike right now on college campuses of rape and sexual assault. Why? Because none of them have been taught sexual harassment. None of them have even been taught bullying prevention from a gender lens. So we have a complete disrespect on the boys' part of girls, and let me make it even more interesting for you, a generation of girls that tolerate this behavior and somehow think it's something that they like. They like it. They're very dismissive of sexual harassment. So that is very seriously what is happening, and this is what we're trying to do with this study, is to say to rape prevention educators, go ahead and do your bullying prevention, but you better augment it with a discussion about attitudes towards girls and talk to the girls about how it is that they tolerate comments and inappropriate touching and do nothing about it. I think this is a normal product of interaction. Okay, does that make sense? This is why we're talking about this morning? Because we can talk about a number of different things. And you should know you have the leading expert right across the bridge there, Nan Stein, out of Wellesley, that has an impact, a very huge impact of understanding sexual violence. Bush, not to pick on Bush, but why not, you know? We're in Massachusetts, not in Texas. So when I do it in Texas, they're all like, she knows she's in Texas? We also have to recognize that in that administration, he also shut down what was called the Office of Civil Rights. Right? So now the door's been reopened, and there was a Dear Colleague letter. Has anyone seen this? I'll send it to Joan. Anyone familiar with the Dear Colleague letter? Yeah, see, this isn't good. We're in the School of Education, and you have no idea that there was a Dear Colleague letter. So the Dear Colleague letter was written by the Office of Civil Rights under Kevin Jennings, the Department of Ed. And it said, Dear Colleague, and that would be principals and superintendents. Really needs to go down to the teacher level. And it said, do not call everything bullying. If, in fact, bullying is directed toward a protected identity, like sexual orientation, like immigration status, like religion, we will prosecute from the OCR perspective. Now, we've been saying that forever to principals, stop calling everything bullying. If they're, snapping bras, and if they're inappropriate touching, it's not bullying. It's sexual harassment. It invokes Title IX. That Dear Colleague letter I will share with you if you're interested, because it's intriguing. It lays out this disaster that has happened and how schools are covering up sexual harassment. And this is a big concern, right? This isn't that we're concerned about kids raping each other in middle school. Certainly there's people that are interested in that, the small cases where it happens. What we're interested in is violence towards women at the adult level. And we are training kids, and I'm going to show you in this study, we are training generations of kids to not only tolerate sexual violence, but to perpetrate it at high, high levels. Okay. So we know that sexual harassment is rampant, and these are a little bit old, kind of older dates and figures, mostly from the AAUW findings, that the majority of kids experience sexual harassment at some level. The more recent data that's emerging is finding that kids are involved in sexual harassment at younger and younger ages. And it's becoming more extreme in the sexual violence and sexual harassment that we see. Now, many of you should not be surprised by this because kids are exposed to sexual kind of figures through technology at a much younger age, right? So when we talk to kids, and we talk to kids about all kinds of things. So when I was just interviewing a young kid about pornography, and I was asking the 7th grader, you know, my IRB loves me, right? So let's go in and talk to 7th graders about pornography. And I was talking to this young boy, you know, and in my mind, I always think about the boy, and we're taping this, in the neighborhood that had the magazine, right? And everybody would flock to the magazine. Like, Johnny's got the magazine. Well, he doesn't have to have it anymore. I mean, this kid was kind of like, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, what sites do you go to? He was like, I can go to anything I want to go to. And it's like the click of a button. And we talked about kind of the images that he saw. And it was very clear to me that their exposure is much more frequent and it's much more severe in what they see in the content. Okay, you can imagine, most of us are like, don't go to those sites and that's fine. But we were trying to understand the culture in which kids live, but yet we don't want to kind of go into those places. So we have to recognize that it's happening younger, and we have to recognize how are we going to prevent it. So this is another, as many of you know, of course, my colleagues don't understand this. Research is not a static notion, right? I mean, we have ever-evolving context that we study in, and we know this from the school perspective, right? 10 years ago, our schools looked very different, our classrooms looked very different. When we were doing some of these large-scale studies, and I always ask the kids when we do studies, I'm a quantitative researcher, but sometimes I have an open-ended thing for them to like put something down in writing, and I often ask them, you know, how else were you bullied? And then about 10 years ago, the kids started saying, well, they're calling me gay and fag. About 5 years ago, that then translated to they're spreading rumors about me being gay or lesbian. Right? Now, in the bullying area, we'd never thought of that. Much like we would never think that technology would be used to terrorize one another. So what we started to see is a huge presence of homophobic teasing. And it's not just directed toward LGBT youth, that it's in fact a general kind of climate issue. And certainly feminist and gender studies folks have talked about in their isolated world the issue that schools are very homophobic and racist, if you will. But there was no discussion about the extent to which homophobia plays out to link bullying and potentially sexual harassment. So in some of our recent studies, we found 30 to 50% of the content of bullying in middle school is homophobic in nature. 30 to 50%, depending on the school, because the climate matters, right? So if you have an administrator that is on the computer looking at pornography and doesn't have Title IX sexual harassment training for his teachers, then you'll probably have a high rate of homophobic teasing. If you have, I don't know, a soccer coach that teaches math class that allows sexual harassment to occur in the classroom, that's setting the groundwork for that. So there's great variability in the extent to which there's overlap. So what do we know? So I said, and I know you guys should go home and go, why are we pumping sexual assault dollars into bullying prevention? We have 3 studies to base that practice on. It's so American, right? So American. Now, and when I talk to my fellow education researchers, they're like, Dorothy, why are you so upset by this? Why does this keep you up at night? They're like, because they would argue that there's math and science types of curriculum that have 0 support. So at least you have 3, studies, but it gets better. So we have a Brazilian study. There's Brazil, sure, okay, better than Norway maybe, where bullying perpetration was associated with sexual harassment perpetration in high school students. Okay, correlational, we all know that that has nothing to do with causation in any capacity. We also could look at Pepler, that's Canadian, so let's draw upon the Canadian researchers. Now in Canada, they are not bound with all of our IRB restrictions, so they actually videotape children to see what they're doing and able to study that process. And they found the overlap with bullying and sexual harassment, but on the victimization side. So if you're a victim of bullying, you're likely to be a sexual harassment victimization. Poly-victimization, we know this from David Fincore's work at UNH. This isn't a surprise in any way. And then a final study of Pellegrini out of Minnesota that did some observations in the classroom, extending it into a short-term longitudinal study and finding an overlap between bullying and sexual harassment from 6th to 7th grade. So we have some suggestion that there's an overlap. If we think about the theoretical framework, and one that I use quite often in my writings and my work and my doctoral students' work, that we have to recognize that bullying or sexual violence emerges as a complex interaction across social contexts, right? So we know that one school is very different than the other school, mostly because the kids are bringing their own kind of individual and familial perceptions and attitudes. They're coming into a classroom in which the peer norms may be very different in supporting bullying or sexual harassment, and certainly the teacher's perceptions vary in the administration and even within the district, in the state, right? So we have a very complex, no one wants to represent the complexity of bullying and sexual violence, but in true, it's very complex. There's a review article on aggressive and violent behavior that I wrote with my colleague from CDC to try to summarize two very separate literatures. So are there any graduate students in here? Please rate any graduates. Yes, pay attention to this part. We need studies. Please email me if you'd like to use our data. We have great data. I'm going to show you the great data. I'm always looking for graduate students to publish this. I can't do it all. I'm tired, right? I'm tired. So, and I get comments from federal review panels that say, you have a lot of second authors. I was like, yes, I do, because we want to get stuff out in the literature that no one reads, right? Okay. So this beautiful research, right? So I was commissioned by CDC, I think in 2004, to summarize everything we know about risk and protective factors of bullying, everything we know about risk and protective factors of sexual violence. Two separate literatures, except for the 3 overlapping studies. About 5,000 articles on bullying, probably a similar amount on sexual violence, but mostly sexual offenders, incarcerated youth, criminologists doing this work. I read many of those articles and summarized into this 30-page article the overlapping correlates. You cannot read this, and that's okay. It's okay. I'm going to show you a summary of this study in this slide. There's overlapping correlates. Now, this does not mean that any study besides the 3 that I showed you studied bullying and sexual violence simultaneously with these correlates. It's 2 literatures separate. And what we find is that on the bullying side and the sexual violence side, there's a general consistent group of correlates. If you think bullying works, you will use bullying. So this positive attitude toward violence. And let me tell you, it does work. We could do an entire talk about the peer norms that support bullying in our schools. On the sexual violence side, if you think that violence works for you, you will perpetrate sexual violence against women and others in your context, in your environment. Anger management. #1 predictor of bullying is anger management issues. I often work with very poor districts in the rural parts of the Midwest who cannot afford a $2,000 initiative. And I say, you know what, from a research standpoint, I said, get a good anger management program. It'll impact bullying. It may get them to stop using alcohol and drugs. Generally, I think as society, we all, when we go get our driver's license, we should take a short-term anger management course. Right? Again, I spend a lot of time by myself, so I talk to people like when I go in and buy something from a grocery store because I want to talk to somebody. Sometimes they're angry, and I said, I really think you need an anger management course. Have you ever tried this where people get upset? It's like just a short-term one, right? So driver's license, parenting class, and anger management. That's what, if I were president, that's what we would do, right? It's not the only thing I would accomplish, probably. And anger is the same within sexual violence, right? And I hope this one slide's in here, but in the sexual violence literature, I fell in love with it, right? This is what's so great about being a researcher and a graduate student, is lifelong learning. Read this literature, and it's very clear how an individual becomes a rapist. They're generally angry, right? They generally have this sense of narcissism. right? So I often say to my college students who are out, drinking too much often, let's just kind of talk about it, and I say to them, never let a man buy you a drink. And they're like, what do you mean? Right? How did this conversation come up? Because it's in the research. The research shows don't let him buy you a drink. Why? Because if he fits in the Malamuth confluence model, and he's narcissist, and he has anger issues, and he buys you a drink, and then you don't reciprocate the way you want to, he may rape you. And they're always like, why are you so negative? The research shows this, absolutely not. So if I'm sitting at a bar by myself, and somebody's like, let me buy you a drink, I said, absolutely not. No. What, do you want me to draw the confluence model? So, you guys work with, tell them this now. What did you learn today on spring break? That's right, yes.
I don't want to interrupt now because you may address it or you may not. What about parental attitudes about all this?
Yes, it definitely moderates. It moderates a lot of these associations where it can buffer or exacerbate. Yes, most certainly we're going to talk about that.
Okay.
That's probably why we will not reduce bullying right now. Because parents' attitudes are promoting violence at the highest rates across socioeconomic status. So it's not just the poor kids where the parents are saying fight back.
Or the opposite, that's just normal boy behavior, or...
You're exactly right. Okay. Parental attitudes we know very little about. In the sexual violence literature, we know that it contributes tremendously. In the bullying literature, I'm not sure if I'm going to talk about it. I'll
okay, great.
Talk about it.
Thanks. Sorry. Okay,
so family conflict and abuse. This is another one no one wants to talk about. 67% of our kids in mostly kind of low-income inner city, that's where we study, because we're not allowed to study the affluent youth. 67% of them have been exposed to domestic violence in the last year. The 0 bullying prevention programs addressed at the primary level address family abuse. Nobody wants to touch it, right? So we have secondary and tertiary programs that try to address that, like family checkup and other types of things. Lots to talk about. Need for control and dominance. Okay, I love going to the zoo. I'm going to go to the zoo with my nieces today, and we're going to study the primates. And they're like, Aunt Dory, this is not fun. I was like, yes, it is. So imagine, look at the primates. And they're just looking at me like, okay, you really just need to have your own child. If you go, and you guys will not look at the primates, look at the primates. Those are classrooms, right? Those are classrooms. That's the hierarchy where we used to teach teachers to know their social hierarchy. We used to teach pre-service teachers to understand the social milieu. This is another thing I want to do. Why not teach the teachers to know who has power in their classroom? Many teachers just know it intuitively. Like Johnny, for some reason Johnny's going to be the name today. Johnny has power and has social power, but probably redirects it into aggression, but teachers don't necessarily always know this. The need for control and dominance, mostly based on primate models, is translating very nicely into peer playgroups. In preschool, we are seeing bullying in preschool playgroups. In the Arizona State University folks, unbelievable bullying in preschool playgroups. What happens is that need for control and dominance, as kids go on through elementary school and middle school, get translated into the subtle form of bullying. We also know that in the area of sexual violence, it is about power and dominance, right? You hear this over and over again. It's not about sex, not about sex. It is about power and dominance. So that's an overlapping correlate. We also know from peer supports, right? If you have a Greek system on campus that promotes violence towards women, you will have high rates of sexual assault. Most rape prevention programs on college campus try to shift the peer norms. If I can go to my fraternity and brag about what I did over the weekend and who I did, that promotes this idea that it's okay. What we want to do is to have the guys say that's uncomfortable. That makes me feel very uncomfortable. But they're not saying that. They're promoting this. In the area of bullying, much of my work has been tracking peer groups and peer norms. It's called homophily. Birds of a feather flock together. If, in fact, I join a peer group in middle school that bullies, I will become a bully over time. And I may be a really good kid from a good family. That's another surprising thing. Like, oh, yes, good kids can bully? Yes, yes. I think we had a case in Massachusetts where there were probably some good kids that were involved in the bullying incident. A narcissistic personality. A lot of the developmental research for many, many years around aggression thought that little bullies were socially unskilled. It was the UK studies that came out and said, wait a minute, some of them have heightened theory of mind. They're able to read their environment, engage their environment. So we now know that perhaps the social skills programs we used in the 90s for the bullies actually just honed their skills. See, I'm just speaking the truth today. Most people won't tell you all this stuff. This is good. So there are the ringleader bullies tend to have the heightened social skills. They can read, they can figure out which victim to go after, and get other really good kids to do bad things. And then low empathy. Now, another huge, interesting, another area of research graduate students is to understand the heterogeneity of empathy among bullies. Many of them know exactly what the victim is feeling, know exactly what perspective you might take as a victim. They don't care, right? So some of the recent research is that we have to go back to our real understanding of the multidimensionality of empathy and understand that if they don't value understanding and implementing pro-social skills, it doesn't matter. So again, we're like, we need to give them empathy. Yes, but we also need to shift their attitudes that are supportive of this behavior. So I'm going to show you some results here of a study that was funded by the CDC. The Centers for Disease Control is nice in that they don't have a lot of money, but they take the risks. So they were the first one to say, okay, what is the overlap between bullying and sexual violence or sexual harassment in middle school kids? And if we continue to just do bullying prevention, garden variety bullying prevention, will we slow down the rates of sexual violence? So this is a nice cohort design here. Essentially, I'll just summarize it for you. We tracked about 1,600 kids total from 6th to 8th grade across 5 time points. They're now in the 9th grade. And I spent yesterday, a day before yesterday, with the 9th grade high school principals, convincing them how we need to continue to track these kids, because you'll see the data we have are beautiful. And I may never get IRB to allow me to ask these questions ever in my life again, in my career. And I'm at year 15 and hit the top and going, just coasting for 15 more years. It's going to be fun. So what did we ask them? This is a survey-based study, 6th through 8th graders. So you have to imagine we're going to ask them a lot of questions. I just showed you a sample of the potential overlapping correlates. But the question is, do these risk and protective factors really predict at the same level bullying and sexual violence? Okay. So we administered a lot of self-report. It was a pretty heavy-duty survey. The kids were quite fatigued by wave 5, so much so that they were opting out. So that's a concern. But missing data imputation has saved our lives, right? We just pretend they're in the study anyway. Okay? So we gave them the University of Illinois aggression scales, which is the bullying, fighting, and victimization. We administered a modified version of the AAUW sexual harassment scale, because kids don't not moon one another anymore. They de-pants. Right, so it's changed. Like in my day, we mooned. Now they de-pant you publicly. That's more of what they do. A lot of kids are not in locker rooms changing anymore, because PE is kind of in the past, unfortunately, in some cases. So we modified it to be a little bit more applicable. But it does include, and I'll show you the items that factor analyze. We also have developed a scale based on a lot of our work, homophobic content and agent, the extent to which they are victims and perpetrators of using the language of fag, dyke, lesbo, and those types of things. Additional measures, again, identified through the literatures, the separate literatures. We had an attitude toward violence scale, one attitude toward bullying, an anger scale, an impulsivity scale, an empathy scale, and I can send this to you. So if you want to, in a couple papers that have been published off this data set. We were able to ask family violence. So we were able to ask the extent to which these kids saw a lot of fights in their house, the general kind of hostility within their home. We also measured sibling aggression. There's about 5 papers written that show that if you are either a perpetrator or a victim of sibling aggression, and not the normal like sibling going back and forth, but more kind of physical sibling aggression, you're 10 times more likely to be a perpetrator in school. Okay, so the family dynamic is playing out tremendously. Need for control and dominance in relationships. This is tricky. We use the AMIRS, which is the a dominance measure developed out of Kansas. Delinquent peers, delinquent involvement, neighborhood disorganization. Remember the social ecology. I'm not going to just measure individual propensity, but the extent to which they're surrounded by disorganization. If we take, a social disorganization theory and apply it to social ecology, you should probably understand their neighborhoods. School climate, which is a big thing, and if you watch the White House, that's all they talked about was changing the school climate, right? No discussion about how it is that we should change pre-service teacher training or administrators' attitude, just climate in general. Abuse items, I was able to ask before the age of 9, have you been to the hospital because you sustained injuries from a caregiver? Have you been touched inappropriately sexually, so childhood sexual abuse? And have you seen your parents hurt one another, so kind of exposure to domestic violence? We also measured masculinity, because I think that had, yes?
I'm sorry, do you think that you got truthful answers on that previous question?
Our rates, shocking in some ways, upwards of 15% of kids reported an experience of childhood sexual abuse. It varied by school.
But so you did get positive.
Yeah.
Oh, negative. or positive.
Yeah, we have names.
We have names. Well, don't you then have?
Oh, love this.
We're forced reporters.
So it's not mandated reporting. This is so, it took me a year to get IRB approval, right? So this is what's called an epidemiological study, an etiological study. Now, I am a mandated reporter as a researcher. The way in which we asked the question is that we assumed that the abuse was not still occurring. So I asked before the age of 9, and all the kids were 11 to 13. As much as I would like to report that 15%, we believe, and we're protected by law, that one, DCFS, which is Division of Child and Family Services, probably the same here. Yeah. When we consulted with them, they said there's no way that we're going to be able to follow up with 15% of your sample. And their advice was that you are risking the abuse getting worse. So we were not required to mandate report, but we assumed it was not happening. We were not allowed to ask these questions in my current randomized clinical trial. The IRB interpreted that as abuse, and we would have to report. Now, why is this important? I mean, I think this is where your ethical, moral kind of responsibility as a researcher is somewhat, compromised, right? Because as much as I'd like to follow up with that 15%, what are you then going to do with that if the kid has to go back to the abusive home? So, I mean, I really struggle with this. At the same time, there is one study on Toth and Cicchetti, one study that links childhood sexual abuse with bullying. One. So we need to study this, right? Like we have to study this in the, so that's a whole nother discussion. Masculinity, we get to pornography consumption. We did ask about magazines and internet, and that does show up as a predictor for us. And then we are tracking social networks to assess peers and doing, yes?
Did you only interview boys?
Boys and girls.
So how did the girls come out on the masculinity scale?
Yeah. So actually, this is the adolescent masculinity in relationship scale.
Okay.
Now, masculinity is very difficult to measure in middle school because you can't say, I think women need to stay home. Yeah. Now, they may have that attitude, but it's really weird to ask kids like, yeah, the place for the woman is in the home. So here it asked a lot of questions about the extent to which boys should keep their emotions inside, and it's okay for boys to brag. So
And
the girls
would answer the same question?
Yeah, they answered the same one. We did have a femininity scale because at that time there was this recent work that came out that showed that being feminine actually is bad for your mental health, right? So, and I love the research because I was like, see, I've always spoken my mind. This is good. I'm good. That's why I'm not depressed. But for the most part, women will just, it's kind of this example of, oh, I love your outfit. How do I look today? Do I look fat? I'm like, no. So this idea that you don't speak the truth. And so we had the femininity scale as well. Now that's showing up that the relationship, this was someone's dissertation that she hasn't completed, just reminder herself. The girls that are dismissive, this trajectory of dismissive of sexual harassment over time is predicted by femininity. So they don't speak up to the boy, right? This idea that, a woman should just kind of, a girl should just
But it's also not like girls can't be bullied.
That's right. That's another myth, too. Yes, they say.
That's not that girls can't be, because I'm hearing different things. I'm hearing that this idea that women shouldn't express, and that my understanding that this perpetual expression seems to be what it's more complex question.
Yeah, so there's this, so for the longest time we were told to girls not to express, right? So girls are just not to express kind of their opinions about things. That's the kind of old model. The new research came out and said, if you adopt in adolescents and even young women, if they adopt that approach, they have more kind of depression. It's not this internalized idea. Now, the girl issue with bullying is a very complex one because the media would tell you that in fact girls are only relationally aggressive, right? So they're actually taking this femininity and spinning it in such a way that I'm not going to tell you to your face. I'm just going to exclude you, and I'm going to spread a rumor back here, and I'm not going to invite you to the mall, and you're not coming to my party. So in some ways, this is circumventing being assertive. Now, that's a complete myth. So Noel Card out of Arizona published a meta-analysis that showed there is absolutely no difference between boys and girls in the way that they bully. Their aggression is, girls can be physically aggressive. In my Chicago public schools, the girls are the ones fighting. They're the ones with the razors in their hair. We have an increase in female offending in this country at hundreds of %. So, you know, we have the mean girl phenomenon that's happening and the queen wannabes. This is a middle to upper class phenomenon. That's all that is. It's white girls with privilege that essentially have nothing else to do, right? I mean, that's what I say to the authors of those books. It's interesting, you're studying, you know, kind of private school phenomenon. So it's a whole nother literature. But what we do know is that to only perpetuate this myth that girls are only spreading rumors and not physically aggressive is done us a great disservice. So much so the federal government's not funding female offending. I mean, these are the disasters of some of these New York bestsellers that are out there in the media. Yes?
What about boys and the overuse of the word gay? Not necessarily meaning, but knowing that that's the way to get to that kid.
That's
like,
what we're going to talk about.
You're so gay.
How are you doing on time?
Sorry.
Isn't this fast? We're going to talk about that.
Okay.
And for many years, when I would first ask these questions on the survey, people were like, well, they don't really mean it. Really? They don't really mean it. They don't really mean to denigrate women when they call boys a certain thing? Like pussy? They don't really mean that? Well, they do mean it. So let's talk a little bit about that. So when we look at the, just so you'll have some contextualization of what we're talking about around sexual harassment. The items are made sexual comments, jokes, or gestures that factor analyzed on the verbal groping scale, showed, gave, or left a sexual picture, pulled at clothing of another student, wrote sexual messages, graffiti about them, spread sexual rumors about them, said they were gay or lesbian, touched, grabbed, or pinched in a sexual way, pulled at their clothing in a sexual way, blocked their way. The second factor was force them to kiss you, force them to do something sexual other than kissing, and then made them touch your private parts when they did not want to. That was the sexual assault. The percentage of that is very low. It was very nice to know that in middle school there's not a lot of sexual assault. Yay. But lots, between 25 and 35% of the verbal and sexual violence in the groping. Okay. I'm going to flip through that. That's an interesting idea. We're not going to be able to unpack that. But let's just look at these percentages. Now, we have 5 waves of data. And this, ignore this idea of the gender by demographic. This is a nice paper we're trying to do to figure out, do we have to ask really who the perpetrators are and the victims are. But what we essentially want to notice here is on the verbal, the kind of groping verbal scale, 27% of the females endorsed at a kind of an occasional time across those items. With the males perpetrating 25%. So the girls are participating in the verbal groping, okay? And that's as victims. Perpetrators is 16 to 22%. And the sexual assault, victims 4% of the females. So the females are showing up as being kind of sexually assaulted a little bit more. And then the perpetrators are just not admitting in some ways at the bottom, so they know they would get in trouble. This is where some of the self-report is compromised. Okay, so let's just do a basic, we have lots of fancy analysis. I decided not to bombard you with all of the latent growth curve analysis. It's not where we're at. I want you to have a message as you leave out the door about what you could do as you think about working even with college students around these issues. These are basic correlations for females. What I'm showing you here is a correlation between the sexual violence measured as the verbal groping, okay? the extent to which they perpetrate. What are the associations, eyeballing the associations with the correlates that we measured? And look at this. This works. So as predicted, anger shows up as a strong predictor. But what you'll notice is that if you perpetrate the verbal groping, there is a correlation of 0.51 with bullying. Now remember that. Remember stats? You square that. There's 25% overlap with bullying and the verbal sexual harassment. Now, in the world of science and social science, we love a correlation of 0.5. But when you square it and you see that there's a 25% overlap, you then recognize there's 75% that doesn't overlap. So if you're only addressing bullying, you're not going to get ultimately to sexual harassment. This is when I love to teach statistics with these data because it becomes real important, real fast, that we do not have a one-to-one correlation here. This is holding up across all of the waves in any way I do it. Logistical regression, structural equation modeling, consistently it's 25% overlap. Homophobic teasing, 25% overlap. Remember, these are bivariate. They're not multivariate, so we can't add them together and think that we're going to have a great time. Pro-attitudes towards aggression correlates. Sibling aggression, 0.3. Again, square that. 9% of the variance in bullying can be accounted for by sibling aggression. It's going to be important as I summarize this research to say we're not looking at sibling aggression. Dismissiveness of sexual harassment. The girls that say, you know, it's just what we do, they're more likely to perpetrate it. Pornography consumption, if the girls are going on the internet and to the magazines and being exposed to this pornography or seeking it out in some ways, they're more likely to perpetrate sexual harassment. Neighborhood violence comes in as a predictor. So we have some nice kind of patterns here. Let's look at the males. Very similar as far as bullying related. Homophobic teasing perpetration, so those kids that are bullying are also using the words of fag and dyke to their friends and everybody that they hang out with. There's also the sense of going back and forth. This gets back to the notion, there's a bantering that happens. So we're looking at some of our data of the reciprocity, that if I call you a fag, I call it back, and this idea that we're creating a culture where that's okay. Now this is, sibling aggression shows up here as well for boys. Delinquent friends shows up, dismissiveness shows up, neighborhood violence. So the social ecology is very nice here in that we have individual predictors. And the peer support, we have a number of papers under review now that if you hang out with kids that perpetrate sexual violence and sexual harassment, you'll do it yourself. They're socializing much like the bullying. Okay, so this is a regression. So this paper is under review at the Journal of Adolescent Health. And what I'm going to summarize here is this shows as the outcome the groping sexual harassment perpetration at wave 2, controlling for wave 1. So we go from correlations where we see these associations. Because we're good scientists, we say, wait a minute, let's control for this so it's not all this kind of model method bias issues. And we find that, of course, at wave 1 it's predictive. Wave 1 predicts wave 2, so your sexual harassment perpetrators at wave 1 are those pretty similar at wave 2. But at the same time we control for that, we find that bullying perpetration is associated, and so is homophobic teasing. So there is an association, okay? But it's not a huge association. There's other types of what we would call kind of misidentified models. So let me break this even further down to understand the complexity here. Now this is one of our longitudinal models that I'm just simply going to put into a mediation, right? And so you remember statistics again for mediation, that a relationship between two variables, bullying and sexual harassment, that relationship is better explained by a third variable. So something in between. So once we enter that third variable, we see that the relationship, 0.5, remember, that's all that is a correlation. Correlation to correlation. Bullying is associated with verbal sexual harassment, but guess what? It goes down when you look at homophobic perpetration. Very complex mediational models have shown us across the 5 waves that in fact bullying leads to, this garden variety bullying, I'm going to call you names, leads to homophobic, you're gay, and guess what? I perpetrate sexual harassment. Let me show you some more, and then we're going to talk about what this means, because this is pretty profound. I don't know about you, but this is exciting, right? Yes. I love it. So let me also show you from the victimization side, which we'll get to your comment as well. If I'm victimized, they call me names, they garden variety bullying. I'm also likely to then enter within the 7th grade in the longitudinal model. They're then going to then change the flavor a little bit, call me these names. And guess what I do? I react by perpetrating sexual harassment. Now, this is not as a strong mediation, but it does drop. There is mediation there. It's called partial mediation. What does this mean? You victimize me in 6th grade, you call me kind of garden variety names, I'm this, I'm fat, anything that's different that you can't tolerate. There's a culture in which it then converts in about 7th grade is when they start using this language a lot more. Well, if in fact the norm is heterosexuality, which it is in our schools, right? There's not many schools that promote anything but that. There are some schools, but not very many. The way in which I demonstrate my masculinity, or demonstrate the fact that I'm not gay or lesbian, is to publicly sexually harass somebody else. Because I certainly would never want to be considered fag or gay. Now, what we find in this model is that kids that are out and are the victims of this homophobic banter do not perpetrate sexual harassment. Because they're like, I'm gay, yeah, you got it, yes, I am, yay, what else you have? They don't respond in that way. Questioning kids, those kids that are kind of in the developmental phase of who they are they bisexual, are they transgender, what is it? They perpetrate sexual violence. Okay. Yes?
So are bullies generally insecure with themselves?
No, that's a good question. So we have thought for the longest time that bullies were socially inept and insecure. No, there's great heterogeneity as far as self-esteem. Well, self-esteem is just a problematic construct in general, right? Like, what does that mean, self-esteem? It's amazing. I'm a psychologist, and you're like, what is self-esteem? But when you look at even Harder's work of self-worth, some bullies are very high on it. Because remember, narcissism, the construct of narcissism in and of itself among bullies is an interesting construct. Because you could put on a public display of narcissism and perpetrate this bullying, but in the inside have this insecurity. There's great variability. So your colleague William Pollack over in Harvard would argue, in fact, that they are. We don't find that. We find great heterogeneity. Some kids are motivated to bully because they feel bad about themselves. Others, they do not feel bad about themselves. They feel like they are completely entitled to act this way, and they have no self-esteem issues. Great heterogeneity. There's not a laundry list that would be consistent across bullies. Yeah.
Are there any studies that measure self-concept, self-esteem in high school and then again as an adult? Because I can see you feel great about yourself in high school because you're the best at soccer, whatever. Does that translate to an adult? Or do those individuals perhaps when they get into the real world and what they felt so great about themselves may not be valued by everybody, does that flip over to an insecurity, or do we not know that?
Yeah, so we haven't had, there's not a single study that's tracked bullies longitudinally in this. We have not measured that. So in the large even ad health data that they're now in their 20s, so in the large Massachusetts data that we've tracked, we haven't tracked that. We're starting to add. But now that the federal government's not really funding, it takes about $10 million, right, to follow these cohorts. They're not funding that stuff anymore, which is unfortunate. I mean, there's some twin studies. So if we can get some twin registries kind of going, we might, we push for the inclusion of that. I mean, I think you're talking about really a high school reunion phenomenon that we all know very well. That you may not know if you haven't been to your high school reunion, but you'll see that some of the boys from high school, whoo, you're like, wow, you're not so hot now, are you? It's not a scientific notion, but I think what you're talking about is real, right? I mean, it's in some ways.
Is it? That's what I'm saying. Is it, or is that like a media perpetrator?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good. I think you have a good point. I mean, I think when we think about the construct of just identity and self-esteem, it's a developmental process that's largely influenced by your context, right? And this is part of the issue in our schools. What do we promote in our schools? We promote athletic and popular kids. Well, they're perpetrating the aggression, right? But the teachers like the athletics and the popular kids. So the teachers in our climates promote these kids, right? It's shocking when we do data and I report it back and I say, your most popular athletic kids are the bullies. No, No. Yes, they are. And
I
they're
don't-
wreaking havoc in your school.
I don't want you to digress even more, but it's just very interesting. I'm Canadian, so I was very shocked moving here how important athletics are here.
Yes.
Does that change the bullying framework? Because you said you looked at things in Canada and Norway. I don't think there's any other country that has that real pressure on and acceptance and glorification of athletes. So does that change the bullying phenomenon from different?
Let me tell you how much it changes it. There's not a single study published on bullying in PE class. There's not a single study published on bullying among athletic groups. You think that's an accident? I don't think it's an accident. I think we have to recognize that even at this level in collegiate athletes, we have colleges protecting boys that are perpetrating sexual violence. They're only now being uncovered, right? Like the Notre Dame case where the girl was sexually harassed by a football player at Notre Dame. You can't get any bigger than football at Notre Dame, right? Sexually harassed so much so that she tried to report it. They quieted her, don't go after that football player. She killed herself. She's out of Northbrook, Illinois. She killed herself. And now Notre Dame's hiding it. I mean, this is happening all over the country now. So the athlete, and will that change? I don't know. When you have somebody running for president and she's glorifying hockey moms, I don't know. Where do we go? I don't know. We're going to go back. So you're exactly right. I think, that there hasn't been a real examination. It's very taboo to question. Athletics dominate schools. They dominate towns. They dominate communities. There's generations of people that live through these sports. So it's a major. I've been asked to not come back to some schools when I presented these days. That's okay.
Well, the parents as well. I mean,
Yeah.
the father who got angry at the coach and, ended up going to prison. So I mean, you have an issue about it. I guess the coach died because of the way he was hit. This was in Massachusetts.
Yes.
And I mean, we have this happen. Where that's not good behavior to show. Now, his son recently was up on charges because he was in it.
Good behavior. Yeah. This is what I'm talking about the White House conference. None of this was talked about. Not parental attitudes, not the fact that we have institutionalized bullying. We have institutionalized it. I mean, I'm in the academy. There's bullying among our faculty members. I was like, can you guys really, honestly? So we have just all these contexts where it plays out, but nobody wants to talk about that. They just want to point to the schools, fix the problem. Yes.
No, I was going to say, wouldn't anger management be one of the things that we should actually add in the curriculum everywhere?
And a lot of the bullying prevention programs talk about that. We teach, kids this, but the modeling that kids observe is so powerful. So let me kind of try to get through this. Okay. This one I want to show you. So this is the other, again, it could be a stats class. This is what's called moderation. I love teaching this. So this is this idea that you have two variables. I'm going back in the classroom in the fall, so I'm just prepping. I've been on grants for a while. So bullying, victimization, and sexual harassment perpetration. So we have a relationship. So anytime, graduate students, you go into your correlation, you're like, there's no correlation. I would say as your advisor, it means there's moderation. And most of them are like, okay, you're so dorky. But yes, so you have a low correlation, and often means that association, which you hypothesize, probably only holds for certain individuals, or in certain conditions. So we have a relationship between bullying, victimization. I'm targeted, they call me names, and it only leads to perpetration when I'm also dismissive of sexual harassment. Let me put it another way. The relationship of being victimized, you call me names, I'm going to perpetrate only if I think sexual harassment is okay. Now, why is this important? This is important because remember the conversation that we started to have that I said 30 to 50% of the content of bullying in middle school, which is the most prevalent, is homophobic in nature. I've now showed you a very complex socialization process where garden variety bullying leads to homophobic bullying, which then sets the stage where I have to demonstrate my masculinity and my heterosexuality by perpetrating sexual harassment towards others. Let's go back to the practice of pumping bullying prevention programs into our school with no attention to sexual orientation or the use of these words. Because teachers and administrators really honestly believe that kids are just using these words because it's just language. They don't really mean it. Yes, they do. It has a very purposeful approach of socializing our kids to perpetuate sexual violence towards one another.
Many principals and teachers, I'm one, so I'm thinking for every general of all principals and all teachers.
Sure.
And I'm very sensitive to that.
Very good. Okay. Yes, that's true. That's very, very much true that we have isolated principals that are doing great things. I'm in 36 middle schools, and I have to actually say, out of the 36 middle schools, I do have about 10 of my principals that get it. I'd say about 10 out of the 36. Now, they also, it's probably a high number, I'd have to say, but they also enrolled in my study, right? So even to talk to me, they get it in some ways. But the 26 others I have to really see. And I also would say, Ron Astor just had a great paper. Ron Astor's out of Southern California, and he gets to exactly what you're talking about. He wrote a paper that he said the most powerful person in your school building is the principal, right, for many different reasons. And if the principal gets it, I mean, he said it in a, in a journal in a different way, but if the principal gets a lot of the psychosocial program and the importance of this, then your programs will work. So he gives it, yes, it's with leadership. Yes, yes.
I'm wondering if you can come back to the division model here
Sure.
as a way of dealing with this, in schools or classrooms.
Sure. Yeah. So if you go, and this afternoon I'm going to do a broader discussion, and that's okay, I think they'll probably take it, but it'll be a broader discussion. But it doesn't matter if we have this, so we can go in and work with the teacher around classroom management, and that's a huge issue.
But just even the concepts, the general concepts, the premises of classroom management.
Oh.
Saying that it's for classroom management or management of this particular issue.
In general classroom management. I think my point is that, okay, so it's twofold. So it's twofold in that at a very basic start, we can't even get to the content of a bullying prevention program being insensitive to the world that kids live in without recognizing that we need to back up and teach our pre-service teachers how to run their classroom to create a safe environment, right? Now, there's a handbook on classroom management that talks about 15 different theories. I teach this course. It's 15 weeks long. There's different ideas about how you manage classroom, from behavioral, like give them gifts, positive behavior supports, all the way to creating caring communities, which I like, this idea that we have relationships with our students. So in some ways, when I started the conversation about the ship has sailed in bullying, it has sailed, and it has sailed without the basic foundation that we need in our classroom. So what does this mean? Bullying prevention programs, which I'm going to talk about this afternoon, are failing in our schools. They are not working. They're working in European countries. No one will tell you this. No one wants to admit that bullying prevention programs are not working. They're not working at the basic level because we're expecting teachers to implement it. I mean, they don't have necessarily a psychology degree to facilitate groups, to facilitate very sensitive conversations around empathy, perspective taking, being a strong ally, alcohol and drug use. We're expecting teachers to be psychologists in the classroom when they have all this other stuff to attend to and they're burnt out, right? And they're teaching to the test. And so that environment, what we've known, and we've struggled for decades around what is good classroom management. Some of it's very intuitive, right? Other times it's not very intuitive. Right? So we don't know exactly in classroom management, separate from if the kids didn't bully at all. So this is where we need to be. The field is out promoting 67 bullying prevention programs that get to none of this content. So I love that you brought me back there, because we can continue to grapple about the content and continue to update the programs, but if we're not recognizing that we need to really train the teachers to feel efficacious about implementing the programs, nothing's working. But I don't know why I'm the only one to say they're not working. They're not working because they're add-on programs, and you're not really increasing sustainability over time because the teachers don't want to implement it. They don't feel good about it. If you train them better, which we do in our randomized clinical trial, and you're in the classroom observing them, for the most part, they develop efficacy over time. You know this, you train teachers, you see it. They come in, they look young, they're scared, they're going out there to student teach. Then you see them that they become masterful teachers. There are masterful teachers. All right. Okay. So let me just do a summary of this. This is one strand of a huge research program that we have going on, right? So you heard that I'm funded by the National Science Foundation. We're developing computer games to really understand bullies and how they really interact and use strategies to gain control over their peers, right? Because this is just survey stuff. We now have a game, which I can talk about maybe this afternoon. We have a game where we create a competitive task. And the bullies are mean. They're mean. They're mean. They're awful. They're like, and they have to get coins in this game. And they will in their chat process, they don't understand. We've used deception in this. They don't understand that we're coding everything that they say. Give me your coins or I will beat you up after school is a common thing. Right? So bullies are playing out in the context, and that's playing out within the context of the classroom. So this is a very small strand of a very active research program that we have going on. And so there is an association between bullying and sexual violence, sexual harassment. Bullying and homophobic teasing are much more strongly related than bullying and sexual violence perpetration. We have complex mediating relationships that support a lot of the sociological theories that gender study folks and feminists have talked about for many years. That, and Einstein would say that schools are a breeding ground for sexual violence and violence against women. She's exactly right, and it appears that it starts in middle school. Right? So lots of training. By the time they get to you in college, they have entrenched ideas about how it is as women they're going to be treated and how it is that men can treat women. So they've been socialized pretty strong. So college is a little bit too late. We need to target the attitudes towards bullying and around sexual harassment. We're mostly Title IX non-compliant in this country, with the exception of a few principals. Right? Who is your sexual harassment coordinator? You know? See? That's okay. No. The fact that you can even retrieve it,
I can.
Good. So in this country, that's very good. Now, you're required by Title IX, and he knows because he's a principal, you're required to have a sexual harassment coordinator. Most of the time, it's the principal. Well, do you think principals are a little busy? Yes. So most of the time when we interview, principals, and we give principal surveys, they're doing nothing around Title IX. They usually invoke Title IX when there's a sexual harassment problem. Right? And it's very gray, Title IX, sexual harassment in schools, but you are required to have a coordinator. Well, when I surveyed teachers in this country, and I just surveyed 7,000 of them, when we asked, who is your sexual harassment coordinator, 99% had no idea what I was talking about. I don't know, is that a problem? I don't know. You have to decide yourself.
Get going.
There we go. Okay. And we also have, I love that he's here too. Like principal takes time, that's great. Sibling aggression is associated with bullying and sexual violence. This is important. Family aggression is playing out. How do we deal with that? We're probably not going to address sibling aggression in a primary prevention program, but we should think about secondary and tertiary programs of family checkup and understand that we can teach kids empathy and perspective taking, but if they're going home, like think about the Maslow hierarchy of needs here, if they're going home where there's family violence and just getting from day 1 to day 2 and through the day is very stressful for these families, primary prevention program is only going to take you so far. And then pornography exposure was associated with sexual violence. I think there's major implications, and I can go on for days. Like I usually give a couple of days workshops to really contextualize the situation in bullying prevention and know that there's not a simple solution. And until we do that kind of work, we're going to continue to be disappointed. Now, part of the problem is researchers hide their data. Right? So you say, well, what about that Norway program? That's what the government's promoting. That Norwegian program was evaluated in South Carolina, and 32 schools never did they publish the data. And I kept saying to my colleague, Dan Olius, who's the kind of bully guy, and I keep saying, just give me the data, I'll publish it. I know you're busy, I'll publish it. Let's just put it in the literature so we can once and for all. Dewey Cornell finally, a couple weeks ago, Dorothy stopped asking him for the data. I was like, why? He's like, just give me the data. He's like, the data are bad. The fidelity and implementation was bad. It wasn't implemented. I was like, well, why is it on the bullyinginfo.org do we say it's a proven program? You'll hear more about this afternoon. It's a major conspiracy that's happening. Not that there's not a lot of them. This is one of them. This is the only one that I can really tackle, not the New World Order, but this one for sure. So related to this research shows that if we continue, and this is not just me in my academic tower, I have now presented these data through webinars to every rape prevention educator in this country. And the message is clear. When you do bullying prevention, if you can talk to the kids about homophobic language, please do so. Please use GLSEN's program. Please use other programs, the World Health Organization's programs, to talk to kids about how this language is used. Now, this is one thing I'm tackling. It could also be that bullying prevention needs to tackle general diversity, okay? There's racism that pervades in our schools that is a large part of the bullying, right? So I was at the White House, sat next to a woman who was running the Center for Islamic Hate Crimes, something. And she is, you know, they're very much concerned about these notions that any kids that's a Muslim, Arab, that they're in fact targets of hate crimes at the highest rates ever, right? Notes in there like, go home, you terrorist, burning their head wrappings. I mean, this is a problem, right? So I think that this is something that we've discovered within the context of our work, and we say to rape prevention educators, please add something around the notion of sexual orientation. And if you can't do that, right, because everybody's sort of nervous about promoting homosexuality, then can we have a conversation about what those words mean? And can we get teachers to stop the use of the words, right? Teachers do not feel, even some teachers, do not feel comfortable intervening when they hear that language. Because they would be intervening all the time. If you create a climate in which those words just do not happen, teachers and principals do not allow it, you have less bullying. I know this. We study it in our large-scale school level analysis. Those schools in which the kids do not hear it, there's less bullying and sexual harassment. Bottom line, it's not rocket science. You don't allow the N-word. Don't allow gay. You don't allow retarded. Don't allow gay. It's that simple. We don't have to talk about, we're not at the point where we're ever going to sit down at this point, although it's improving, where we embrace multiple sexual identities in some of our schools. There are some schools where there's gay, straight alliances. It's a great place to be, and you come out, and it's a beautiful process. That's not for all of our schools. We have homophobic teachers. I live in the Midwest, trust me. Homophobic teachers. Not all of them, that's for sure. Okay, and so of the 67 programs, just so you know, 5 of them discuss sexual orientation. 5. And it's usually something like this. You can be bullied because of race, sexual orientation, disability. That's it. That's what the 5 do. Right? 30 to 50% of bullying in middle school is homophobic in nature. We sat at the White House, and I said to Kevin Jennings, who's gay, at the end of the research panel, I said, Kevin, honestly, I got 2 words for you. He was like, what, Dorothy? I said, sell out. I walked off. And he's like, don't worry about it. We're going to have an LGBT youth summit. I was like, okay, that's great. We're going to put all the people that think the same. I said, this was a platform. You are here because of It Gets Better. The It Gets Better campaign was because LGBT youth were killing themselves. He's like, well, they're not all at risk. I said, I understand. 12 to 19% of them were suicidal. Only 12 to 19% of LGBT youth in our schools are suicidal. It's not 100%. There's really kids that are enjoying their homosexuality. Okay? I'm in the middle of writing that up for Ed Researcher. So we actually have our leading journal in education that's willing to put in their journal LGBT stuff. We're on it. Well, I didn't sleep last night. We're going to, before they change their mind. Do I have anything else? No. Questions? I have no idea what time it is. Sorry. Look at that. Perfect. Yes.
I have a whole bunch of questions, but I won't dominate. But I'll start. One thing you didn't talk too much about it, but it was over the internet, bullying over the internet. I have 2 teenage sons, and it's something we talk about a lot. And the question they always ask me is, why don't these people turn their computers off?
Very interesting, right? Okay.
I just want to know what your take is on that.
It's very complex. It's that's what we say, so politician-like. I'm going to talk a little bit about it this afternoon, but I think the takeaway messages right now is that the media has created quite a frenzy. Okay, they have created this notion that cyberbullying is at the highest prevalence rates ever. Now, if you are good consumers of data, which generally Americans are not, right? We read the paper and we think it's just the Bible in some way, right? If you look at the data, they're presenting lifetime statistics, right? So they ask kids, has someone said something mean to you through a text message? Well, many of us were probably like, yes, my mother was not so nice.
Yeah.
So many of us would say, yes, this has happened. If you look at closer, and if you look at the time frame, which reporters don't report the time frame, right? They don't want to do that. It's not going to sell papers if they contextualize it and the numbers go down. Okay? So if you look in the last month, and if you look at over time, repeated in some ways, the percentages are very low. Now, that said, so that means, and I'm going to present again this afternoon, that you have victims on average that in our schools, 17% of our kids are victimized. 15% are bullies. We're at 32. 8% are bully victims, your school shooters. That's 40%. And the rest are the bystanders that are standing around doing nothing and actually encouraging it, right? That is a lot. That's a high prevalence. On average, you have 1 to 3% of kids that are sexting, right? But you think, like, sexting is just happening, turn off your phones, it's sexting. And then, depending on the number, we have about 10 to 12% of kids that have experienced cyberbullying to the point where it's distressing. Now, when it happens, it may be a smaller percentage of time, it has a larger impact, especially for those kids that don't turn off their computer, right? Because we were talking at breakfast this morning, always interesting conversations, that somebody might have spread a rumor 20 years ago about me, but it was so ridiculous by the time it got to the end, right? The quality, the integrity in a rumor now on the internet stays. I mean, it's pretty consistent. It doesn't change. So it can have a really wide